The Chinese often say that their country has a history of more than 5,000 years. The exact length is open to interpretation, but the earliest archaeological records are from what is called the Shang dynasty. Bronze vessels, jade articles and pottery have been discovered dating from as early as 1600 BC, around 3,600 years ago, or perhaps even earlier. Animal bones called oracle bones, which have pictographic characters written on them, have also been found. This is now considered to be the earliest form of Chinese writing. After the Shang dynasty came the Zhou dynasty, when the realm was ruled over by kings through a network of feudal states. This whole period can also be divided up into the Western Zhou and the Eastern Zhou period. The first part of the Zhou dynasty was fairly peaceful, but after 476 BC, we had what is called the Warring States period. 7 prominent states emerged, and there was huge rivalry between them. During this period, there were also a number of influential ancient Chinese thinkers, including Mencius and Confucius. Eventually, after hundreds of years of battles, the states of Qin and Chu rose above the other states, and in the end it was the state of Qin that took power and established China's first dynasty, the Qin dynasty. The Qin dynasty was ruled over by China's first emperor. He centralized the power of the state, created a system of laws, standardized units of weight and measurements across his territory, and he also standardized the writing system. They weren't quite the Chinese characters we know today, but they were related. The first emperor imposed heavy taxes and started a lot of construction projects, including the First Great Wall. He even ordered books that he didn't agree with to be burnt. The Qin dynasty was very short, and the first emperor died in 210 BC. He was buried in a vast tomb in what is now the city of Xi'an. He's famous for being buried with a huge army of 6,000 terracotta statues, the terracotta warriors, and a lot of treasure that he wanted to accompany him into the afterlife. After the Qin dynasty, a person called Liu Bang led a revolt and founded the Han dynasty. The Han dynasty established a bureaucratic system where promotion was based on merit. It was also during this period that Confucianism was adopted by the state for the first time. The Confucian classics were compiled and used to inform the state. There was a short period of chaos in the middle of the dynasty when a person called Wang Mang temporarily took over the throne. The later Han dynasty kept a lot of records. We have information about the official music bureau, sacrifices and court rituals, and new farming techniques. Much of the Han dynasty coincides with the period of the Roman Empire. The Chinese classic of history and new forms of poetry were written during the Han dynasty. Paper was made for the first time. There were new agricultural tools. The wheelbarrow was developed. There were new methods of smelting metals and new herbal medicines. The bureaucracy and the cultural system of the Han dynasty was so successful that it became a model for later dynasties. The period of Chinese history after the breakup of the Han dynasty was very violent, and to be honest, it's a bit complicated. There were a lot of changes in rule and the boundaries of states. In the north, the authority passed to a general called Cao Cao and then to his son in 220 AD. Then there was a big fight for power with 2 other kingdoms, Shu and Wu. So the battle between these 3 kingdoms is now legendary in Chinese history. The kingdom of Wei defeated the others, but then was itself defeated very quickly, and the Western Jin was founded in 265 AD. There was a peace for a short time, but it didn't last. And then there were invasions of Xiongnu barbarians. The whole of North China was covered by different barbarian states, which have become known as the 16 Kingdoms. The northern Wei was the kingdom which managed to hold the largest area for the longest time. In 317 AD, a member of the Jin imperial family established the Eastern Jin dynasty, but it was largely at the mercy of landowning families. Rule over South China, the area south of the Yangtze River, in the Middle Ages was just as messy. The period there in this time is often known as the Six Dynasties, which lasted up until about 589 AD. During this time there was a proliferation of popular religions, including Taoism, which was seen as a mystical belief system. By this time Buddhism had also spread to China, originally from India, and was adopted by many of the barbarian kingdoms in the north of China. After about 400 years of chaos, China was unified again in 581 AD under the Sui dynasty. They set up a number of government institutions that were to become adopted by later dynasties. There was also a plan to build a unified canal system across the whole empire. However, rebellions arose throughout the kingdom, the dynasty fell, and after a few years the Tang dynasty was established under the Emperor Li Yuan, who was also known as Gaozu. There were a lot of remnants of Sui and rebel armies that had to be defeated in order to consolidate the Tang Empire. The Tang dynasty ruled China for about 3 centuries and is seen as a golden age in Chinese history. It had a very strong bureaucracy and system of institutions with a national entrance exam for the civil service. Chang'an, which is now the city of Xi'an, was established as the capital. There were a number of battles against barbarians and tribes. The empire became much bigger. Trade along the Silk Road expanded. The countryside was placed entirely under imperial control, but it was leased out to the people in something called the equal field system. It was a golden age for painting, high poetry, pottery and Buddhism, and a lot of foreign cultural elements were integrated into the state. The Tang dynasty also saw a powerful woman ruler usurp the imperial throne, Empress Wu Zetian. In the middle of the Tang dynasty there was a rebellion called the Anlu Shan Rebellion, which severely weakened the central power of the state. And on the borders of the Tang state there were also barbarian tribes which formed their own dynasties. In 960 AD there was another coup, and an emperor who became known as Taizu founded the Northern Song dynasty, and he established a capital at Kaifeng. He managed to incorporate a lot of powerful generals into his empire by giving them military positions. There was once again a unification of most of the country, a strong bureaucracy and a civil service system, and the state started to emphasize Confucianism again. The Confucian classics were re-examined by a scholar called Zhu Xi, and Neo-Confucianism was born. Eventually the Jurchen tribes invaded the Song and put the capital under siege, and then the northern Song fell. The invasion didn't get as far as the south, and the southern Song was established, with its capital in Hangzhou. This was a time of great scholar officials, and fine poetry and paintings were produced. The southern Song became highly wealthy, and they expanded foreign trade. They built China's first real navy, and developed improved gunpowder weapons. The Song were able to keep the Jin dynasty at bay, but they couldn't stand an invasion by the Mongols. The Mongols defeated the Jin dynasty, and they established the Yuan dynasty in China in 1271. Kublai Khan was known as the Great Khan as well as the Emperor of China, although his grandfather Genghis Khan was put down as the founder of the dynasty in the historical records. Kublai Khan built a capital where Beijing now stands. He improved agriculture, expanded the Grand Canal from north to south, expanded trade along the Silk Road, introduced paper money, received a number of missionaries and travels from abroad, including supposedly Marco Polo. He also increased contact with the West and consolidated the Mongol Empire and consolidated China under a number of different provinces. The court was a mixture of Mongol and Chinese culture, and Buddhism, Taoism and Western religions flourished. Rivalries at court, conflicts with the native Chinese culture, etc., weakened the dynasty. Then, after a series of natural disasters, rebel movements arose and the Mongol dynasty in China fell, and a new native dynasty arose out of the struggle, the Ming dynasty in 1368. The Ming dynasty brought about a long period of stability to the country. The emperor who founded the Ming became known as the Hongwu Emperor. The dynasty accepted tribute from all over Southeast Asia and even beyond. One of the most well-known Ming dynasty emperors was Yongle. He expanded the capital in Beijing, and he built a secondary capital in Nanjing. He had the Forbidden City, the Imperial Palace, built in Beijing, and the imperial tombs built on the outskirts of the city. His most trusted eunuch, Zheng He, became an admiral, and he was sent on long diplomatic missions by sea as far as the Middle East and Africa. The Ming Dynasty established special trading offices for dealing with international trade, which expanded rapidly, and there was an influx of foreign silver into China. During this period, the Great Wall was extended, and many of the great classic Chinese novels were written during the Ming Dynasty as well. Towards the end of the Ming Dynasty, there were failed harvests, floods, and a massive disease which spread all over the country. Then the peasant rebel leader Li Zicheng took control of Beijing in an invasion from Manchuria, which is the area in the northeast of China. The Qing dynasty ruled China from 1644. China was again ruled by a foreign people, the Manchus, who were descendants from Jurchen tribes. Later, the Kangxi Emperor adopted the bureaucratic system, the civil service exam system, and the Confucianism from earlier dynasties. He expanded the borders of the empire and built up the power and confidence of the Qing state. Then, the Qing dynasty was ruled by two powerful emperors, Yongzheng and Qianlong, and they continued military campaigns to expand the empire. But meanwhile, in the 1700s, European powers had been building up great maritime empires based on international trade, especially the Dutch and the British under the British East India Company. The Qianlong Emperor famously told a British trade envoy that his empire had no need for European goods. The British were importing silk, tea, and ceramics from China, and they were exporting opium to China, mostly from India, where they were growing it. The Qing dynasty banned opium because it's a very harmful drug in 1838, and a minister, Lin Zexu, dumped opium supplies into the sea. This outraged the British, and the British declared the Opium War, and the Chinese military was simply too weak to resist. So China was forced to open up 5 ports to international trade and give Hong Kong Island to Britain. And then there was a revolt against the Qing in 1851 by a man called Hong Xiuquan and his supporters. And this person thought he was a modern-day Jesus. But the Qing dynasty managed to put down this rebellion. Then there was a second Opium War in 1858. And in 1860, the British and French marched on Beijing and looted the old summer palace. The Qing attempted to go through a period of self-strengthening, and they did make some reforms to try and catch up with the Western powers. In 1897 and 98, Western countries took more territories in China, and then the British gained more of Hong Kong. A group of people called the Boxers rebelled against these losses of Chinese territory to Western powers and the recent rise of Christianity in China. These Boxers fought an army of 8 Western powers. They smashed European property and put foreign legations in Beijing under siege. But the Western powers sent in troops, and the Empress Dowager Cixi, who was nominally in power at the time, and the Emperor fled. So these events left the Qing dynasty in crisis, and there were attempts at reforms, and a rising reformer, Sun Yat-sen, he focused on trying to find a solution to revive China. But after the Xinhai Revolution in China, the Republic of China was established under Sun Yat-sen, and then was ruled over by Yuan Shikai. But there was no strong government to rule over the country, so attempts to establish a parliament under the constitution failed, and China fell into the power of warlords. And during this period, the Nationalist Party was struggling to keep control of the country. The Communist Party was founded in 1920. So in 1925, Chiang Kai-shek, who is called Jiang Jieshi in Chinese, he became leader of the Nationalist Party, which was supposed to be in charge. And then in 1931, Japan invaded northeast China, the area called Manchuria. And in December 1936, the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party agreed to unite together to fight the Japanese. The Japanese stepped up their invasion of China in 1937, savaging the country and committing large-scale war crimes, including massacre and rape. You might have heard of the famous rape of Nanjing. In 1940 and 1941, the alliance between the nationalists and the communists really started to break down, and the two sides were already engaged in a full-scale civil war between the nationalists and the communists for control of the country. World War II ended in 1945, and the Communist Party had seized control of China and declared the People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949. The nationalists retreated with their troops to the island of Taiwan. And since 1949, the Communist Party has ruled China as an authoritarian one-party state. And Mao sought to make China into a socialist state using a modified Marxist-Leninist system. He carried out land reform, and during his Great Leap Forward campaign, he collectivized the country, which meant he put it under collective control, and he also called for industrialization of the country. Unfortunately, though, during this industrialization, a large part of the agricultural labor force was taken away, which caused huge food shortages and famines. Historians estimate that these policies may have caused the deaths of more than 40 million people. During Mao's Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 76, Mao's regime purged a huge number of people who disagreed with his rule, and there was widespread chaos and looting by Mao's supporters, the Red Guards. The violence and chaos completely disrupted normal life in China. Although there's heavy criticism of Mao Zedong's policies, some argue that his regime was responsible for reducing the gap between the rich and the poor and for making people more equal. Mao also helped to turn China into an industrial power and developed its infrastructure. After Mao Zedong, there was a short power struggle, and China has been led since then by Deng Xiaoping, who reformed the country and opened up the economy to the outside world in the 1980s, and he begun China's meteoric economic growth. He was followed by Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping, who took over the top position in 2012. In Chinese thinking, history is often described as a cycle of dynasties rising and falling. As the opening to the historical novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms says, "The empire long divided must unite, long united must divide." Since the Communist People's Republic of China was established, there's been an emphasis on continuity and a single line of history, simply building on the past and establishing a connection with it, not claiming to have started again. Does this mean that Chinese history will no longer be seen as a cycle? Of course, official histories and accounts are often written by the winners of history. I can only offer so much in a basic introduction, so I hope I've given you a good overview. But rather than comment any more, I'll leave the interpretation to you. The Chinese often say that their country has a history of more than 5,000 years. The exact length is open to interpretation, but the earliest archaeological records are from what is called the Shang dynasty. Bronze vessels, jade articles and pottery have been discovered dating from as early as 1600 BC, around 3,600 years ago, or perhaps even earlier. Animal bones called oracle bones, which have pictographic characters written on them, have also been found. This is now considered to be the earliest form of Chinese writing. After the Shang dynasty came the Zhou dynasty, when the realm was ruled over by kings through a network of feudal states. This whole period can also be divided up into the Western Zhou and the Eastern Zhou period. The first part of the Zhou dynasty was fairly peaceful, but after 476 BC, we had what is called the Qin dynasty. The Qin dynasty was ruled over by China's first emperor. He centralized the power of the state, created a system of laws, standardized units of weight and measurements across his territory, and he also standardized the writing system. They weren't quite the Chinese characters we know today, but they were related. The first emperor imposed heavy taxes and started a lot of construction projects, including the First Great Wall. He even ordered books that he didn't agree with to be burnt. The Qin dynasty was very short, and the first emperor died in 210 BC. He was buried in a vast tomb in what is now the city of Xi'an. He's famous for being buried with a huge army of 6,000 terracotta statues, the terracotta warriors, and a lot of treasure that he wanted to accompany him into the afterlife. After the Qin, called the Warring States period, 7 prominent states emerged, and there was huge rivalry between them. During this period, there were also a number of influential ancient Chinese thinkers, including Mencius and Confucius. Eventually, after hundreds of years of battles, the states of Qin and Chu rose above the other states, and in the end it was the state of Qin that took power and established China's first dynasty,